Christmas is usually associated with joy, love, and time spent with family. But for one family in North Carolina, December 25, 1929, turned into a day of unimaginable tragedy. On that fateful Christmas day, Charlie Lawson, a respected farmer from Germantown, shattered the festive spirit forever by violently killing his wife and 6 of his children. This prompts the haunting question: what led Charlie to commit such a gruesome crime? Was it financial hardship, mental instability, or perhaps something more sinister? Join us as we delve into the chilling story of the Lawson family murders, a tragedy that still looms over the small town of Germantown. Charles Davis Lawson, commonly referred to as Charlie, was born on May 10, 1886, to Augustus and Nancy Lawson. The family resided in Lawsonville, where Charlie later met and married Franny Manring in 1911. Together, they had 8 children. Tragically, their 3rd child, William, died of pneumonia in 1920 at the age of 6. The surviving children were Marie, aged 17, Arthur, aged 16, Carrie, 12, Maybelle, 7, James, 4, Raymond, 2, and Marilou, who was just 3 months old at the time of the massacre. 7 years after marrying, Charlie moved his family to Germantown, a quaint North Carolina town with a population of fewer than 1,000 residents, to be closer to his extended family. His younger brothers, Elijah and Marion, were already established there, working in tobacco farming. Charlie began as a sharecropper before eventually saving enough money to buy a small plot of land on Brook Cove Road, adjacent to his brother's property. This allowed the family to enjoy more time together, as they had hoped when they first relocated. Charlie would labor in the fields during the day and rebuild the tobacco barn in the evenings with Franny, Marie, and Arthur helping him. During one such evening, Charlie suffered a head injury while working in the tobacco barn due to an accident involving a piece of rotten timber and an axe. Following the injury, those around him noted a significant change in his personality. Though Charlie was always known for having a temper, his violent outbursts became increasingly frequent and severe. This head injury may have contributed to his eventual actions. The Lawsons appeared to be an ordinary and well-liked family. In the weeks leading up to Christmas of 1929, the family had experienced a particularly good harvest, which may explain why Charlie took them shopping in Winston-Salem, a larger city about 20 kilometers from Germantown. With Christmas approaching, no one found it unusual for the family to be out shopping. However, given that the Great Depression was just beginning, it was rare for working-class families to make such a public display of spending money. This has led many to speculate that Charlie had already planned the murders and was unconcerned with long-term finances. Additionally, it was reported that Charlie told his family that the shopping trip was part of a big Christmas surprise. Adding to the oddity of the situation, Charlie took his family to have a professional portrait taken, an uncommon and costly endeavor for a working-class family at that time. The resulting family photo was unsettling. Marie stood beside Charlie, appearing angry, while Franny looked anxious. To this day, the circumstances surrounding the portrait remain unclear. 2 weeks later, on Christmas morning, Charlie and Arthur went rabbit hunting, a local tradition in Germantown. This explains why neighbors were not immediately alarmed when they heard gunshots later in the day. Meanwhile, back at the house, Marie was busy baking a 2-tier cake, carefully decorating it with raisins and icing. Upon arriving at their hunting spot, Arthur realized they had no ammunition. When he asked his father about it, Charlie claimed they had none left and instructed Arthur to go to the market to buy more. With Arthur gone, Charlie began his murderous rampage. To this day, it remains unclear why Arthur was spared. Was it pure coincidence, or did Charlie intentionally keep him away because he feared Arthur could intervene? Carrie and Maybelle, on their way to visit their uncle, unknowingly walked through the tobacco barn, where Charlie lay in wait. As they passed, he shot both girls with a 12-gauge shotgun. He then returned to their bodies later to bludgeon them, ensuring they were dead. Charlie proceeded to the house, where he found Franny on the porch, peeling potatoes. He shot her in the chest, killing her instantly. Hearing the commotion, Marie began screaming inside and told her younger brothers, James and Raymond, to hide. Charlie entered the house and shot Marie before finding and killing the 2 younger boys. Finally, he made his way upstairs where 3-month-old Marilou lay in her crib. He bludgeoned her to death, fracturing her skull. Since hunting was common during Christmas, no one rushed to the scene immediately, allowing Charlie time to flee with the family's dogs. He wandered into the woods near the property, pacing around a dogwood tree before eventually turning the gun on himself hours later. Arthur, still in town buying ammunition, returned home to discover the horrifying aftermath. Charlie's brother Elijah, accompanied by his 2 sons, arrived shortly after and found the bodies arranged with their arms crossed and rocks beneath their heads as makeshift pillows. Each of the family members was dressed in the new clothes Charlie had bought them during their shopping trip 2 weeks prior. News of the massacre spread quickly throughout the tight-knit community. As residents gathered around the Lawson home, a gunshot echoed from the nearby woods. Rushing towards the sound, Arthur and a police officer discovered Charlie's lifeless body surrounded by letters addressed to his parents. However, the notes provided no insight into his motive. 2 tobacco auction receipts were also found in his pocket, each bearing an unfinished note. One read, "Trouble can cause," and the other stated, "Nobody to blame." Snowfall that day, estimated between 6 and 8 inches, made it apparent that Charlie had been pacing around the dogwood tree before ending his life, as a clear patch of ground was visible amidst the surrounding snow. Since the house was situated on a hill, transporting the bodies was challenging. Neighbors borrowed bed sheets from the Lawson home to fashion makeshift sleds, dragging the bodies down to the road. They were taken to the Walnut Cove Funeral Home, but due to the sheer number of deceased, arrangements had to be made with Madison Newton's funeral parlor on Murphy Street. The autopsies were conducted by Dr. C.J. Hasselbeck, the Stokes County coroner, and Dr. Spotswood Taylor, a pathologist from Johns Hopkins Medical Center in Baltimore, who happened to be home for the holidays. Dr. Taylor removed Lawson's brain for further examination, preserving it in formaldehyde. The goal was to determine if any abnormalities might explain Lawson's actions. While they noted that his brain was smaller than average and that its center was underdeveloped, they found nothing conclusive to explain the crime. Adding another layer of tragedy, the entire Lawson family was buried together in a single plot. Since 3-month-old Marilou was laid to rest in her mother's arms, there were 7 graves in total. The headstone bore a poignant inscription, "Not now, but in the coming years, it will be in a better land. We'll read the meaning of our tears, and then sometime we'll understand." The gruesome events shocked the small town and drew national attention. Even the New York Times featured the case on its front page with the headline, "Stokes Farmer Kills Wife and 6 Children." Thousands of people attended the funeral with cars lined up for over 4 kilometers. Only 10 days after the burial, Charlie's brother Marion opened the family home to the public as a macabre tourist attraction. He fenced off the property and began charging an admission fee of 25 cents per person. Though some criticized him for profiting from the tragedy, Marion defended his actions, saying the proceeds would help Arthur pay off the mortgage. Despite the controversy, the house drew significant crowds, sometimes attracting up to 500 visitors daily. Marion advertised in local newspapers, further boosting interest. People visited not just out of curiosity but with a strange desire to collect gruesome souvenirs. Visitors reportedly took blood-stained bricks from the fireplace where Marie had died, bark from the dogwood tree where Charlie ended his life, and even raisins from the cake Marie had baked on Christmas morning. To prevent further tampering, Marion encased the cake in a glass container. Rumors circulated that infamous mobster John Dillinger, who had escaped from prison, visited the Lawson home and left a mocking note for law enforcement. While this story remains unverified, it adds to the dark legend surrounding the case. By late January 1930, the family's belongings were auctioned off, including their clothing, furniture, and even the murder weapon. Marion set up a tent on the property to sell the last remaining items as memorabilia. The sale of these morbid keepsakes only fueled the public's fascination. Arthur, the only surviving member of the family, never publicly discussed the tragedy. Sadly, in 1945, he was killed in a freak accident at the age of 31, leaving behind a wife and 4 children. Eventually, the Lawson family house and the tobacco barn were demolished. Over the years, locals reported sightings of ghostly children playing in the area and claimed that Charlie's spirit could be seen near the dogwood tree. Others mentioned that during autumn, leaves would fall everywhere except in the circular patch where Charlie had paced before taking his life. Similarly, snow reportedly never settled in that spot. Years later, Madison Newton's funeral parlor, now known as Madison Dry Goods, capitalized on the tragedy by opening the upstairs mortuary to the public. The owners, Richard and Kathy Miller, restored the space and displayed memorabilia, including photographs of the Lawson family, further preserving the macabre legacy. The Lawson family tragedy inspired songs, books, and poems. One of the most popular songs was "The Murder of the Lawson Family" by the Carolina Buddies, which sold over 8,000 copies, an impressive figure given the economic hardships of the Great Depression. Two notable books were written: White Christmas, Bloody Christmas by M. Bruce Jones and Trudy J. Smith, published in 1990, and The Meaning of Our Tears by Trudy J. Smith in 2006. Over time, many theories have surfaced as to why Charlie Lawson committed such a horrific act, with only a few seeming plausible. One theory suggests that Lawson may have witnessed an organized crime incident. Some believe that he and his family were killed by others, with the crime staged to look like a murder-suicide. However, this theory lacks substantial evidence and remains speculative. Another theory points to the head injury Charlie suffered years earlier while working on the tobacco barn. Those close to him had noticed a significant change in his behavior after the accident. His temper worsened and his mood swings became more frequent. This has led some to believe that the injury may have caused a neurological condition, contributing to his violent outburst. However, the autopsy performed by experts from Johns Hopkins did not reveal any major brain abnormalities. While some argue that medical examinations at the time may not have been thorough enough to detect such issues, the theory has largely been dismissed. The most widely accepted theory revolves around the possibility of incest and a resulting pregnancy. Decades after the murders, this theory came to light through interviews with relatives and close friends of the Lawson family. Stella Lawson, a relative, claimed she overheard older family members discussing how Franny had been worried about Charlie's inappropriate behavior toward their eldest daughter, Marie. A friend of Marie's, Ella May, also revealed that during a sleepover, Marie had confided that she was pregnant with her father's child and that her mother was aware of it. Additionally, a neighbor named Sam Hill recalled that tensions in the Lawson household had escalated and that Charlie had threatened Marie, warning her against exposing their relationship. While autopsy reports did not indicate a pregnancy, it's possible that it was either too early to detect or that the information was deliberately omitted to protect the family's reputation. Unfortunately, by the time DNA testing became a viable option, the bodies were too decomposed for any further analysis. Another theory attributes the murders to financial stress. With the Great Depression beginning to take its toll on working-class families, Lawson may have felt overwhelmed by his financial burdens. It is speculated that he may have viewed the killings as a way to reunite the family in the afterlife, sparing them from a future of hardship. This theory, while grim, is considered plausible given the economic uncertainty of the time and the pressures Lawson likely faced. Despite these various theories, no clear motive has ever been confirmed, leaving the Lawson family murders an enduring mystery. The Lawson family murders remain one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in American history. Despite countless theories and speculations, no definitive explanation has ever been found. What do you think drove Charlie Lawson to commit such a horrific act? Which theory seems most credible to you? Could Marie have known something was going to happen? The next case we will be looking at is the Twisted Watts family murders. In the quiet suburban town of Frederick, Colorado, nestled between rolling plains and the Rocky Mountains, the Watts family lived what appeared to be an idyllic life. Their 5-bedroom home on Saratoga Trail, complete with a spacious lawn and scenic surroundings, painted the perfect picture of the American dream. Neighbors would have described them as friendly, engaged, and seemingly content, a family like any other. Christopher Watts, or Chris as most called him, worked as an oil field operator for Anadarko Petroleum, while his wife Shanann managed her own business from home, promoting a lifestyle and wellness product called Thrive. Chris and Shanann's story began like many others. Born in Spring Lake, North Carolina, Chris was known as a quiet, introverted young man with a passion for cars. Shanann, on the other hand, hailed from Aberdeen, North Carolina, and had an outgoing, ambitious personality. The couple met in 2010, and despite their differences, they complemented each other well. Chris admired Shanann's drive and determination, while she found his calm demeanor grounding. After dating for 2 years, they married in a beautiful ceremony in Mecklenburg County in November 2012. Their life together quickly grew to include 2 daughters, Bella Marie, born in December 2013, and Celeste Catherine, affectionately known as Cece, born in July 2015. By all outward appearances, the Watts family thrived. Shanann documented much of their life on social media, frequently posting photos and videos that showcased happy moments, family outings, celebrations, and milestones. She often praised Chris in her posts, calling him a loving husband and doting father. Their daughters were adorable, energetic, and full of life. In early 2018, Shanann announced that she was pregnant again, this time with a boy they planned to name Nico. Despite the curated image of perfection Shanann shared online, life wasn't as smooth as it seemed. In 2015, the Watts family filed for bankruptcy, citing $70,000 in debt, mostly from credit card expenses and student loans. While Chris continued working in the oil industry, Shanann's income from her multi-level marketing business was inconsistent, adding financial pressure. The bankruptcy filing painted a picture of a family struggling to keep up with the expenses of their seemingly comfortable lifestyle. Yet, outwardly, they maintained appearances and moved forward. By the summer of 2018, Chris and Shanann's marriage had hit a rough patch. While Shanann was focused on growing her business and preparing for their 3rd child, Chris began to pull away emotionally. He had grown distant, and unbeknownst to Shanann, he had started an affair with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger. Nicole, unaware of the full extent of Chris's life, believed he was in the process of separating from his wife. Their relationship intensified over the summer, with Chris spending more time away from home and less time with his family. On the weekend of August 11, 2018, Shanann traveled to Arizona for a business trip with her colleagues. While she was away, Chris stayed home with their daughters. According to later reports, this weekend marked a turning point in Chris's behavior. He spent much of his time communicating with Nicole, while simultaneously portraying a normal routine to his daughters and neighbors. In the early hours of Monday, August 13th, Shanann returned home from her trip. Her close friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson, who had accompanied her on the trip, drove her home around 1:48 a.m. Before parting ways, Nicole noticed that Shanann seemed unusually tired and emotionally drained, a stark contrast from her usually energetic self. Shanann entered her home, expecting to find her husband and daughters asleep. Little did anyone know that this would be the last time she was seen alive. Later that morning, Chris left for work. Around midday, Nicole became concerned when Shanann missed a scheduled obstetrics appointment and failed to respond to her messages. She knew this was uncharacteristic of Shanann, who was meticulous about her responsibilities, especially regarding her health and her children's well-being. Concern turned to alarm when Shanann also missed a business meeting. Determined to find out what was wrong, Nicole drove to the Watts residence around 12:10 p.m. Nicole rang the doorbell and knocked repeatedly, but there was no answer. She tried calling Shanann's phone, only to hear it ringing from inside the house. Growing increasingly worried, she contacted Chris, who claimed he was at work and unaware of Shanann's whereabouts. Nicole then called the Frederick Police Department to request a welfare check. At approximately 1:40 p.m., Officer Scott Coonrod arrived at the Watts residence. Chris, notified by Nicole, rushed home shortly afterward. When he arrived, he appeared calm but cooperative. He gave Officer Coonrod permission to enter the house, where they found Shanann's purse, keys, and phone, along with the family dog, unharmed. However, there was no sign of Shanann or the girls. In another troubling discovery, Shanann's car was parked in the garage with the children's car seat still inside. As Chris answered the officer's questions, his demeanor remained unsettlingly composed. He explained that Shanann had taken the girls to a friend's house after an argument early that morning, a story that Nicole found implausible. Shanann had never mentioned any plans to leave, and her absence without any communication was entirely out of character. By the evening, the FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, had joined the search, escalating the situation to a high-priority investigation. Chris, still maintaining his innocence, appeared on local news stations, pleading for the safe return of his wife and daughters. Standing in front of his home, he spoke directly to the camera, asking anyone with information to come forward. His expression, however, lacked the urgency and emotional depth one might expect from a man whose entire family was missing. His statements were methodical and rehearsed, prompting viewers and investigators alike to question his sincerity. Behind the scenes, investigators were already growing suspicious of Chris. His version of events didn't align with the evidence, or the lack thereof. Search dogs brought onto the property failed to pick up any scent of Shanann or the girls leaving the house. Moreover, security camera footage from a neighbor's home revealed something Chris hadn't mentioned. Footage showed him backing his truck into the garage in the early morning hours, shortly after Shanann had returned home. Police believed he had loaded the bodies of his family into the truck before driving off. As the investigation intensified, detectives pressed Chris for more information. On August 15th, after failing a polygraph test, Chris confessed, first to his father, Ronnie, and then to law enforcement. However, his initial confession was a lie. He claimed that Shanann had strangled their daughters in a fit of rage after he told her he wanted a divorce. In response, he said he had strangled Shanann in a moment of blind fury. This story, investigators knew, was a desperate attempt to shift blame. Under continued questioning, Chris eventually admitted to killing Shanann and the girls. He revealed the location of their bodies, a remote oil storage site owned by his employer, Anadarko Petroleum. Investigators arrived at the site that night and made a grim discovery. Shanann's body was found buried in a shallow grave, while the bodies of Bella and Cece were submerged in separate crude oil tanks. The condition of the girls' bodies, which had been pushed through narrow hatches at the top of the tanks, left no doubt about the brutality of the crime. The community of Frederick was left in shock as news of the murder spread. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile the Chris they thought they knew, a quiet, helpful family man, with the man who had committed such heinous acts. Shanann's family was devastated. They had welcomed Chris into their lives, trusting him as a husband and father, only to see that trust betrayed in the worst possible way. By August 21st, Chris Watts was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, in addition to charges of unlawful termination of a pregnancy and tampering with deceased bodies. He faced the possibility of the death penalty, though Shanann's family later requested that prosecutors not pursue it, wishing to avoid further loss of life. Chris eventually pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for life sentences without the possibility of parole. What drove a seemingly normal man to commit such unimaginable crimes against his own family? In the weeks and months that followed, investigators, psychologists, and the media would grapple with that question. Chris's chilling confessions and the calculated nature of the murders raised disturbing questions about his psyche and the hidden cracks in a seemingly perfect family. This was just the beginning of a case that would captivate the nation and leave an indelible mark on true crime history. On the morning of August 13, 2018, Chris Watts's life was poised to take a dark and irreversible turn. Shanann Watts, 15 weeks pregnant with their 3rd child, had arrived home only hours earlier after a weekend business trip to Arizona. Exhausted from travel, she hadn't anticipated what would unfold after walking through the door of their Frederick, Colorado home. This seemingly ordinary Monday would soon be anything but, as Shanann and her 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste, disappeared without a trace. Chris began his day in routine fashion, heading off to work at Anadarko Petroleum. In stark contrast, Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson grew increasingly uneasy. Shanann wasn't responding to texts, calls, or her doorbell. A meticulous and organized person, Shanann never missed scheduled commitments, especially medical appointments. She was due to visit her obstetrician that morning, but never showed up. As concern turned into alarm, Nicole took action. Around 12:10 p.m., Nicole arrived at the Watts residence. Knocking and ringing the doorbell brought no response. Looking through the windows, she could see no sign of Shanann or the girls. Desperate, she called Chris, who was already at work, and informed him that something was wrong. Chris dismissed her concern, suggesting that Shanann had taken the girls on a playdate. But Nicole wasn't convinced. She knew Shanann well enough to sense that something was off. Her persistence prompted her to contact the Frederick Police Department and request a welfare check. At approximately 1:40 p.m., Officer Scott Coonrod arrived at the Watts residence to conduct the welfare check. Shortly afterward, Chris returned home, appearing composed but cooperative. He granted Officer Coonrod permission to enter the house, where they discovered Shanann's belongings, including her purse, keys, and phone, inside. Her car, still parked in the garage, contained the girls' car seats, and Shanann's wedding ring was found on the bedside table. Nothing seemed out of place, but the absence of Shanann and the girls, combined with the presence of their personal items, raised red flags. Chris maintained that he had last seen Shanann at around 5:15 a.m. before he left for work. He claimed they had argued about their relationship and future, but insisted he had no idea where she might have gone. Despite his calm demeanor, Nicole sensed something wasn't right. She continued pressing for answers, while Officer Coonrod documented the situation and initiated a search for the missing family. By the following day, the situation had escalated. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Razuchek, who lived in North Carolina, were informed of the disappearance. They were immediately concerned, as it was unlike Shanann to simply leave without a word. Shanann's father urged police to intensify their efforts, fearing for the safety of his daughter and granddaughters. The Frederick Police Department enlisted the help of the FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, transforming what initially appeared to be a missing persons case into a full-scale investigation. Meanwhile, Chris appeared on local television, delivering a plea for his family's safe return. Standing outside his home, he looked directly into the camera, asking anyone with information to come forward. His words, however, seemed hollow. Those who watched the interview couldn't help but notice Chris's oddly detached demeanor. Rather than exuding the desperation and anxiety of a husband and father, he came across as unnervingly calm, almost rehearsed. Behind the scenes, investigators were already skeptical of Chris. His behavior was inconsistent with that of a distraught husband and father, and the timeline he provided raised several questions. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera revealed something Chris hadn't mentioned. In the early morning hours of August 13th, shortly after Shanann returned home, Chris was seen backing his truck into the garage. Investigators suspected that he was loading the bodies of his wife and children into the vehicle before driving to the oil field, where they would later be discovered. As the pressure mounted, investigators took a strategic approach to uncover the truth. On August 15th, Chris agreed to take a polygraph test, believing he could outsmart the process. Administered by FBI agents, the test was designed to determine whether he was being truthful about his family's disappearance. After several hours, the results were in. Chris had failed the polygraph. The failing result marked a turning point in the investigation. Confronted by the evidence, Chris began to crack. Initially, he refused to provide any details, insisting he didn't know what had happened to his family. Detectives, however, employed a different tactic by allowing Chris's father, Ronnie Watts, into the room. The father-son bond created a moment of vulnerability, and Chris finally confessed. But it wasn't the full truth. Chris claimed that he had strangled Shanann in a fit of rage after discovering that she had killed their daughters. He insisted that Shanann had smothered Bella and Celeste, and that he had acted in retaliation. This story, while implausible, was an attempt to shift the blame onto his deceased wife, painting her as the villain in the tragedy. Investigators, however, weren't convinced. They knew Chris was lying but needed more evidence to prove it. With Chris's partial confession in hand, investigators pressed further. They questioned his motives, timeline, and actions leading up to the murders. Eventually, He led them to the location where he had disposed of the bodies, a remote oil storage site owned by Anadarko Petroleum, his employer. When investigators arrived at the site, they made a chilling discovery. Shanann's body was buried in a shallow grave, while Bella and Celeste's bodies were submerged in separate crude oil tanks. The grim scene painted a picture of unimaginable brutality. The narrow hatches through which Chris had forced the girls' bodies were only 8 inches wide, highlighting the horrifying lengths he had gone to in disposing of the evidence. Bella, the older of the 2 girls, bore scratches on her body from being pushed through the small opening. A tuft of her blonde hair was found on the edge of one of the tanks. The medical examiner's report revealed more disturbing details. Shanann had been strangled, and her unborn son Nico had died as a result of the trauma. Bella and Celeste had been smothered by Chris's bare hands. Despite Chris's initial claim that he had killed Shanann in response to her harming the girls, the evidence clearly pointed to premeditation. There was no indication that Shanann had harmed her daughters. Instead, it was Chris who had planned and executed the murders. With the discovery of the bodies, Chris Watts was arrested and charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and tampering with a deceased human body. The charges reflected the severity of his crimes, and the district attorney announced that he would seek the death penalty. As the case garnered national attention, the Watts family became the focus of intense media scrutiny. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers expressed their shock and disbelief. How could a seemingly normal man commit such monstrous acts against his own family? What drove him to murder his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters? Psychologists and criminal experts weighed in, offering theories about Chris's mindset. Some speculated that financial pressures, combined with his affair and the impending birth of a 3rd child, created a situation he felt he couldn't escape. Others pointed to his apparent narcissism and lack of empathy, characteristics often associated with family annihilators. Former FBI profiler Candace DeLong noted that family annihilators like Chris often exhibit a need to maintain control. When their carefully constructed lives begin to crumble, they may resort to extreme measures to regain that control. One detail that emerged during the investigation was Chris's relationship with Nicole Kessinger, his co-worker and mistress. Nicole later claimed that she had no idea Chris was still actively involved with Shanann or that she was pregnant. She described Chris as being distant and cold in the days leading up to the murders. Nicole cooperated fully with investigators, providing text messages and phone records that further implicated Chris. By the end of August, Chris's legal team was in discussions with prosecutors about a possible plea deal. Shanann's family, who had already endured unimaginable loss, made a difficult decision. They asked prosecutors not to pursue the death penalty. They didn't want any more lives lost, even that of Chris. Their wish was to see him serve the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chris ultimately accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to all charges on November 6, 2018. The deal spared him from the death penalty, but guaranteed that he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. On November 19th, he was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 84 years for the other charges. He showed little emotion during the sentencing, a stark contrast to the grief-stricken statements made by Shanann's family. The judge, in delivering the sentence, remarked on the heinous nature of the crimes, calling them the most inhumane and vicious crimes he had ever encountered. Chris Watts was immediately transferred to prison, where he began serving his sentence, a life confined to a cell, haunted by the weight of his actions. Yet even with Chris behind bars, the questions remained. What truly drove him to commit such a horrific act? Was it a moment of impulsive rage, or had he planned the murders in cold blood? Could anything have been done to prevent this tragedy? The answers, as elusive as they were, would continue to haunt those who knew the Watts family and the millions who followed the case. In the months following the sentencing, more details about Chris's mindset began to surface, shedding light on the dark reality of what had happened within the walls of the Watts family home. But the story of Chris Watts was far from over. It had already become one of the most infamous cases of family annihilation in modern history, and the public's fascination with it was only growing. On August 15, 2018, Chris Watts sat across from investigators at the Frederick Police Department. After 2 days of mounting suspicion and unanswered questions, the search for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste had intensified. Detectives knew something wasn't right. Chris's behavior was unsettling, his story inconsistent. That morning, as a polygraph test was administered, the tension in the room was palpable. The result was unequivocal. Chris had failed. Confronted with the evidence and realizing the walls were closing in, Chris made a partial confession, a carefully crafted lie designed to deflect blame. But as the investigation unfolded, so did the horrifying truth of what had transpired in the Watts household. In the interrogation room, Chris was under immense pressure. His father, Ronnie Watts, had been allowed into the room to speak with him privately, a tactic used by investigators to elicit information. Tearfully, Chris admitted to killing Shanann, but with a disturbing twist. He claimed that Shanann had strangled their daughters after he told her he wanted a divorce, and in a fit of rage, he retaliated by killing her. It was a desperate attempt to shift the blame and evoke sympathy, but investigators were unconvinced. Chris's story didn't match the evidence. Shanann's friends and family had described her as a devoted mother who adored her children. The idea that she would harm them was unthinkable. Moreover, forensic evidence from the house suggested a different sequence of events, one where Chris was the sole perpetrator. His confession, while incomplete and dishonest, provided enough information for investigators to make a breakthrough. Chris was placed under arrest, charged with multiple counts of murder, and held without bail. Late that night, using a map provided by Chris, investigators arrived at a remote Anadarko oil field where he had worked. There, they made a grim discovery. Shanann's body was found in a shallow grave, hastily covered with dirt. Nearby, 2 large crude oil tanks stood ominously against the dark sky. Investigators soon realized that Bella and Celeste's bodies had been dumped inside these tanks. The process of retrieving the girls was delicate and harrowing. Each body had been forced through an 8-inch hatch at the top of the oil tanks, an act so cruel and calculated that it shocked even seasoned investigators. Bella, the older of the 2 girls, had scratch marks on her body, indicating she had struggled as Chris forced her into the tank. These details painted a chilling picture of the final moments of the Watts family. Autopsies later confirmed what investigators already feared. Shanann had been strangled to death. There were no defensive wounds on her body, suggesting she had been caught off guard and was unable to fight back. Bella and Celeste had both been smothered, likely with Chris's bare hands. The medical report also revealed that Shanann had been 15 weeks pregnant with a baby boy, whom she had planned to name Nico. Perhaps the most heart-wrenching discovery was that Bella, the eldest daughter, had fought to stay alive. Her autopsy revealed injuries consistent with a struggle, and it was determined that she had been awake during the ordeal. This detail above all horrified the public and left an indelible mark on those who followed the case. The innocence of 2 small children and an unborn baby had been brutally extinguished by the one person they trusted most, their father. As the gruesome details emerged, the question on everyone's mind was, why? What could drive a seemingly normal man to commit such a monstrous act against his own family? Over time, various theories were proposed, but Chris's motive remained elusive. During interviews conducted months later, Chris admitted that he had been planning the murders for weeks. His affair with Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker, appeared to be the catalyst. Chris had envisioned a new life with Nicole, free from the responsibilities of fatherhood and marriage. It was revealed that he had given Shanann oxycodone in an attempt to terminate her pregnancy, believing that without a 3rd child, it would be easier to walk away. Chris later confessed that on the morning of August 13th, after Shanann returned home from her trip, he strangled her in their bedroom. Bella and Celeste, who had likely heard the commotion, walked in shortly after. Chris told them that their mother was sick and he loaded their lifeless mother into the back seat of his truck. With his daughters in tow, he drove to the oil site, where he carried out the second part of his plan, killing Bella and Celeste. What makes this crime even more chilling is the cold, calculated manner in which Chris carried it out. He had planned every step, from disposing of the bodies to fabricating a story about Shanann leaving with the girls. He had even researched the logistics of using the oil tanks beforehand, ensuring that their bodies would be concealed for as long as possible. This premeditation turned what might have been seen as a crime of passion into a methodical, remorseless annihilation of his family. On August 21, 2018, Chris Watts was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 additional counts of murder for killing children under the age of 12, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The charges reflected the heinous nature of his crimes and carried the possibility of the death penalty. In November, as the case moved toward trial, Shanann's family made a heart-wrenching decision. Despite their grief, they requested that prosecutors not seek the death penalty. They believed that another death, even Chris's, would not ease their suffering. Respecting their wishes, the district attorney offered Chris a plea deal. He accepted, pleading guilty to all charges in exchange for 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. On November 19, 2018, Chris Watts was sentenced. In addition to the life sentences, he received 48 years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy and 36 years for tampering with the bodies. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars without the possibility of ever walking free. The Watts family murders captivated the nation. The sheer brutality of the crime, combined with the seemingly perfect image of the Watts family, made it a media sensation. Documentaries, news specials, and talk show segments dissected every detail of the case. Shanann's family, while mourning their loss, also faced harassment from conspiracy theorists who claimed the murders were a hoax. Despite their pain, they remained steadfast in honoring Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico's memory. In 2020, Netflix released American Murder: The Family Next Door, a documentary that used archival footage, including Shanann's social media posts and police recordings, to tell the story from her perspective. The film reignited public interest in the case and shed light on the dangers of intimate partner violence, a silent epidemic that often goes unnoticed until it's too late. The Watts family murders left an indelible mark not only on the town of Frederick, Colorado, but on the entire country. It served as a chilling reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that even the most idyllic lives can hide dark secrets. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico's lives were tragically cut short, but their memory lives on through their surviving family and those who continue to tell their story. Today, Chris Watts remains incarcerated at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. He lives in isolation, far removed from the life he once shared with the family he destroyed. His story stands as one of the most disturbing examples of familicide, a case that shocked a nation and shattered countless lives. The next case we will be looking at is the Muller family. On January 11, 1996, the Muller family opened its doors to people they thought were just going to be friends, not knowing the horror they were inviting in. By the next morning, the entire family was gone, never to be seen again. Today, we're going to be piecing together the timeline of what happened and how white supremacist men, hiding under a friendly disguise, were able to murder an entire family in cold blood and almost got away with it. It's March 23, 1996, a day that would turn into one of the most senseless and brutal crimes you can imagine. But like most tragedies, it starts small, with 2 men and a violent plan for the future. Chevy Kehoe, 26, grew up in a family where white supremacy was the whole lifestyle. Kehoe wasn't your average disillusioned teen. His father's influence took the family from Florida to Madison County, North Carolina, when Chevy was an infant. They thought they were working towards a better life, not knowing they were moving towards their own end. Then in 1985, the Kehoes packed up again, heading to Stevens County, Washington, where they lived near Deep Lake. This is where Kehoe's educational career changed entirely. While he was once an honor student at Colville Junior High School, his academic path soon veered into a different direction, one that no one saw coming at the time. By 1988, his parents pulled him out of public school and decided that homeschooling was the way to go. They thought they were just going to help the kid get the one-on-one attention he clearly needed. It was the perfect environment for radical ideas to grow. The Kehoe household was steeped in anti-government sentiment, and Chevy soaked it all in like a sponge. He became increasingly obsessed with the idea of toppling the U.S. government and creating his own white supremacist militia, his self-styled Aryan People's Republic. His desire for violent revolution wasn't just a passing phase, it was a core part of his identity, nurtured from a young age. Kehoe's life outside his violent ideology was deceptively normal. His marriage to Karina Gum and their 3 children appeared to be that of a typical family, but in reality, it masked his commitment to white supremacy. He made little attempt to hide his racist views, which increasingly dominated his thoughts and actions. Kehoe's first marriage in 1993 to Angie Murray was a brief and disastrous affair, lasting only 54 days. This short-lived relationship foreshadowed the growing instability in his personal life as his views turned more extreme. His obsession with his ideology grew stronger, pushing him further toward violent actions, ultimately leading him down a dark and irreversible path. By the time he and Daniel Lee began their killing spree, Kehoe's beliefs had warped his sense of reality. His actions were no longer driven by financial or personal gain, but by a twisted desire to advance the racist worldview that had consumed him. His tragic transformation into a cold-blooded murderer, fueled by hatred and extremism, just shows the disturbing consequences of unchecked radical beliefs. Lee, just 22 at the time, was every bit as dangerous as Kehoe, though for different reasons. Lee's history was marked by violent tendencies and a growing record of criminal activity. By 1993, he had already committed an act of violence, stabbing a man, solidifying his reputation as someone capable of brutality. When Kehoe and Lee met, their shared belief in igniting a race war quickly bonded them. They didn't just want to talk, they wanted action. Their idea of advancing their cause was through crime, using violence and terror as means to fund and support their twisted agenda. This mentality led to the senseless targeting of 52-year-old William Muller, his 45-year-old wife Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah. The Mullers, like many families, were simply trying to live their lives. They had no connection to the criminal world and no involvement in any radical ideology. But to Kehoe and Lee, they were nothing more than a means to an end, a way to fund their misguided, dangerous dreams, marking the Mullers as innocent victims in a senseless crime that would forever alter their community. The plan was simple: rob the Mullers, take whatever cash or valuables they could find, and use it to fuel their so-called revolution. But this was more than just a robbery. Kehoe and Lee never planned to leave witnesses behind. What started as a twisted scheme was going to turn into a nightmare. Kehoe and Lee, 2 men, each with a personal mission to make the world a better place, for white supremacists, that is. These 2 weren't just your average criminals. They were a walking disaster waiting to happen, and it was only a matter of time before things went south. Growing up as the eldest of 8 children, Kehoe was homeschooled in a setting that reinforced extremist ideologies. By his early 20s, he had fully adopted his family's racist views and was determined to create a whites-only nation, using violence to achieve his goals. Lee also had a troubled upbringing with instability and violence. He suffered from seizures and neurological issues, leading to time in mental health facilities, from which he was removed because of violent behavior. At 17, Lee participated in the brutal murder of Joseph Wavra, the 3rd during a robbery, but managed to avoid a murder charge, getting only a suspended sentence for robbery. This leniency did little to curb his violent tendencies. The 2 met in 1995, sharing hatred for the government and the will to establish a white supremacist stronghold. Kehoe was already leading his own organization called the Aryan People's Republic, and he saw in Lee as a willing accomplice, violent, impressionable, and eager to follow orders. Their partnership was a mix of shared ideologies and the will to commit extreme acts to further their cause. In January 1996, they set their sights on the Muller family in Arkansas, seeing them as targets to fund their extremist activities. March 23rd was a day like any other for the Muller family. At least that's how they saw it. William, Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah were just trying to live their normal lives. They weren't involved in any dangerous politics, they weren't wealthy, and they certainly weren't on anyone's radar. But to Kehoe and Lee, they were just another target, another piece on the board in their delusional quest to fund a whites-only nation. Kehoe's criminal activities began to take shape in 1995, starting with a violent kidnapping and robbery. In June of that year, he and an accomplice targeted Malcolm and Jill Friedman, a Jewish couple who owned a store where Kehoe had once worked. The Friedmans were held at gunpoint, their identities potentially targeted because of their ethnicity. It's a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. A pattern of escalating violence fueled by Kehoe's twisted beliefs and desire for power. But the crimes would only get worse as time went by. In January 1996, Kehoe and Lee left Washington and traveled to Arkansas. Their destination was the home of William Frederick Muller, a well-known gun dealer who lived near the small town of Tilly, Arkansas. Muller was a man who had everything Kehoe wanted: a large collection of firearms, ammunition, and cash. In fact, Kehoe had already robbed Muller once in February 1995, and he returned for a second, more profitable haul. Kehoe and Lee arrived at the Muller home on January 11, 1996, disguised as FBI agents, only to find that the family was not there. They waited for the Mullers to return, and when they did, Kehoe and Lee overpowered them. William and Nancy Muller were quickly incapacitated, but it was Sarah Elizabeth Powell, their 8-year-old daughter, who would face the brunt of the cruelty. Sarah was interrogated about the whereabouts of the family's fortune, and Kehoe shocked her with an electric cattle prod until she gave up the information. When they finally found $50,000 in cash along with guns and ammunition, you'd think they'd just come for and leave. But things started to get worse from there on out. The Mullers and Sarah were subdued with stun guns, causing them to lose consciousness. They did this part as slowly as they could, almost as if they were enjoying it as they did it. Then, Kehoe and Lee suffocated them with sealed plastic bags over their heads. Lee hesitated when it came to Sarah, possibly unwilling to kill the young girl, but Kehoe showed no hesitation. By 10 p.m., less than an hour after they had arrived, Kehoe and Lee had done what they came for. They took whatever valuables they could find, including William's gun collection. They discarded the bodies afterwards at the Illinois Bayou, where they weighed them down with rocks and threw them into the fast-moving water to make sure the authorities wouldn't be able to find any trace of the Mullers. But while the bodies may have been dumped in an attempt to erase the crime, Kehoe's carelessness would eventually catch up to him. Some of the firearms from the robbery had been registered in a federal firearms license registry, which allowed the ATF to trace the weapons back to several men in Spokane, Washington, men who confirmed they had purchased them from Kehoe and his father. The violence had become a pattern, but Kehoe wasn't done. His path of murder, manipulation, and theft was just starting, leading him deeper into chaos. Local authorities were still piecing together the family's sudden disappearance with no leads but the weapons they traced, until a group of fishermen changed everything. 2 days after the murders, some fishermen came across a grim sight no one could prepare for: the lifeless bodies of the Muller family floating in the water in late June 1996 in Lake Dardanelle near Russellville, Arkansas. This discovery was the first step toward unraveling what had happened. The discovery of William, Nancy, and Sarah Muller's bodies was the start of a nationwide manhunt. By the time authorities identified the victims, Kehoe and Lee had already fled. Kehoe's next move would see him on the run, pushing his violent path even further into chaos. On February 15, 1997, Kehoe and Cheney were in Wilmington, Ohio, when an Ohio State Highway Patrol trooper, John Harold Harker, stopped their vehicle, a blue Chevy Suburban, for driving erratically and with expired registration. The trooper found that neither brother had a driver's license. Kehoe, in the driver's seat, initially complied with orders, but warned the officer against touching him when the trooper tried to search him. The situation escalated when Deputy Robert Gates arrived to assist. As the officers tried to handle the situation and prepare to tow the vehicle, Kehoe ran back to the Suburban, with the officers in pursuit. At this moment, Cheney took out a handgun from the passenger seat and began firing on the officers. This allowed Kehoe to escape into the vehicle and flee the scene. But he was on a killing spree, and nothing was going to come in his way. Later that day, Kehoe was involved in another exchange of gunfire, this time with Wilmington police officers Richard "Rick" Wood and Sergeant Robert "Bob" Martin in the parking lot of an electrical supply company. During this second confrontation, a 56-year-old Frank Marsden was hit in the shoulder. The shootout was recorded on dashboard cameras of the patrol vehicles, and the footage would later be widely broadcast, first appearing on Fox's World's Scariest Police Shootouts in 1997. After the shootout, the Kehoe brothers went on the run, evading capture as they traveled through several states. They eventually settled in a ranch in Utah, where they worked for a time for a local ranch owner. But Cheney noticed Chevy wasn't in his right mind anymore, so they started having ideological differences and bitterness, which eventually led Cheney to surrender to the authorities. He also helped direct the police and the FBI to the ranch in Utah, where Chevy was finally arrested on June 17, 1997, and put on trial. Once Chevy Kehoe was caught in 97, the legal consequences hit fast. He was slapped with a long list of charges including racketeering, murder, and robbery. Basically, they were coming for him for everything he'd done. In March 1999, the courtroom was preparing for a verdict that seemed almost beyond belief. Chevy, the mastermind behind a heinous double murder, escaped with a life sentence. Meanwhile, his accomplice Lee received the death penalty. Despite being the brains behind the brutal crime, Kehoe managed to avoid execution. By contrast, Lee, whose role in the murders was markedly less direct and who lacked the intellectual capacity to fully grasp the scope of the plan, was sentenced to death. This difference in the severity of the sentence seemed to defy logic. How could the man who orchestrated and executed such a calculated plan receive a less severe punishment than his subordinate? Lee had a troubling past marked by a juvenile record, violent behavior, and a pattern of criminal acts, including multiple stabbings. On the other hand, Chevy was a white supremacist who was the more dangerous of the two and received the lesser sentence. The disparity seemed less about the nature of their crimes and more about his ability to bend the law to his will. Lee's background made him look unstable and impulsive, which might have tipped the scales against him. Despite his violent past, he took the opportunity to plead for mercy, insisting that he had a good side. This was a person with a well-documented past of criminal acts, from petty crimes to outright violence, including stabbing incidents. His argument was on the idea that he was capable of change and that what he needed was guidance and support to nurture this alleged better version of himself. It seemed ridiculous that anyone would believe his claims. Redemption arcs may work well in movies, but not in the courtroom. If there was any truth to his claims, it was too late. His record left little room for the second chances he wanted. Then, just when it seemed like it might all be over, the pandemic in 2020 delayed Lee's execution indefinitely. Kehoe denied everything, but the evidence was stacked against him. In 1998, he pled guilty to felonious assault and attempted murder over a shootout with cops in Ohio. The shootout happened when Chevy and his brother Cheney were stopped by a trooper for driving erratically that turned into a wild gunfight. The police almost didn't make it out, but the real weight was the 1996 murders of William Muller, his wife Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah. Kehoe and his buddy Lee had killed the family after robbing them for cash and guns. The stolen guns were traced back to Kehoe, and that's what sealed his fate. In 1999, he was convicted for the murders and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the chance of parole, and both his mom Gloria and his brother Cheney turned on him and testified in court. Cheney had already split from Chevy over their violent disagreements, and in the end, he helped put his brother behind bars. Their testimony was the final nail in the coffin that locked up Chevy for life. Kehoe's dad, Kirby, didn't escape either. He pled guilty to racketeering and got 44 months in prison. Cheney got 24 years for his role in the Ohio shootout, but that sentence was reduced, and he was out by 2008. But Kehoe didn't go down without a fight. He appealed his conviction, but every single appeal was shot down. By 2020, he was bounced between prisons, but he's still locked up, serving life without parole. In 2013, Cheney and Kirby got into more trouble, but were arrested after a raid in Arizona turned up a huge stash of weapons and marijuana. Both went back to prison, But Cheney was out again by 2016 and Kirby in 2022. So here we are, the final act of justice. Lee, the man who somehow managed to survive all the chaos he caused, was finally about to get executed. But just when you thought he might actually reach a logical conclusion, things took another turn. The family of the victims weren't allowed to attend because of COVID-19. The same pandemic that had already delayed the execution now conveniently kept the victim's family from being there to witness justice firsthand. The irony of the situation was almost too much to handle. As for the execution itself, it was as you'd expect, cold and methodical. A lethal injection was the final step in what felt like a never-ending nightmare. Was it justice? In a way, yes. But in the grand scheme of things, it was just another sad chapter in a tragedy that had left so much pain in its wake. No amount of death could ever really change what had happened, and if anything, the whole thing felt just like another pointless act in a play no one asked for. This crime wasn't just about murder. It was about everything that came after. The justice system, the families, the public debate, it's all connected. And while some might point to Lee's execution as a victory, all it really did was reinforce just how little of it actually was fixed. Because in the end, justice isn't clean. It's messy. And in this case, it left a stain that nobody could wash off. But could the legal system have done a better job? We would love to know your thoughts in the comment section. If you like the way we create these videos, and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.